And now, without further ado, tonight's speakers. Josh Tuininga is the author, artist, and designer living in North Bend, Washington. After studying fine art at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, he founded an art and design agency where he continues to work as its creative director. Tuininga is the author of 2 children's books, Why Blue and Dream On. We Are Not Strangers, which has been awarded a 4-Culture Heritage Grant, is his first graphic novel. Dr. Devin E. is the Isaac Aldov Professor in Sephardic Studies, Associate Professor of History, and faculty at the Strum Center for Jewish Studies in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. He holds a PhD in history from Stanford. His first book, Jewish Salonika, Between the Ottoman Empire and Modern Greece, was published by Stanford University Press in 2016. The book won a 2016 National Jewish Book Award, among numerous other awards. Tom Ikeda, founder of Densho, established the nonprofit in 1996 to preserve and share World War II Japanese-American incarceration history, promoting justice and equity. Tom conducted over 250 video oral history interviews, created anti-racism curriculum, and spoke against Muslim travel bans, family separation, detention, and anti-Asian hate. He has received numerous awards for his historical and community contributions, including the Humanities Washington Award, National JACL Japanese American of the Biennium Award, Japanese American National Museum Founders Award, and Washington State Historical Society's Robert Gray Medal. Right? To say it is an honor to have these 3 joining us here tonight would frankly be an understatement. The response for this event has been nothing short of astounding. As I'm sure many of you are aware, we were originally set to host this event in September at our Ravenna location, reaching the capacity in just a couple of weeks. Seeing as we're all here tonight at Lake Forest Park and there's about 300 or more of us, I would be amiss not to recognize all of you wonderful people and the community surrounding the proven life-altering art of the written, and in this case, illustrated word. Based on the experiences and life of Tuininga's uncle's grandfather, We Are Not Strangers follows Japanese and Jewish Americans living side by side in a country at war. Following Marco's grandfather's perspective, we learn of his life as a Sephardic Jewish immigrant and his struggles as he settles into an America gearing up its war efforts. Papu befriends Sam Akiyama, a Japanese man who finds his world upended from Executive Order 9066. Determined to keep Sam's business afloat while he and his family are unjustly imprisoned, Sam and Papu create a plan that will change the Akiyama's lives forever. In many ways, it is an ode to and a recreation of the history of Seattle's Central District and to the people no longer with us who created our past and continue alongside us in our present through their stories, their struggles, and the communities they created. It is a great privilege to introduce our guests of honor tonight, so please join me in welcoming Josh Tuininga, Dr. Devin E, and Tom Ikeda.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Third Place Books for hosting us today. I hope everybody has a chance to support this awesome bookstore while you're here. I also want to thank both my guests for coming to join the conversation. Really happy you guys are both here. So let's talk about We Are Not Strangers. So for those of you who don't know, this whole project started with a story that my uncle told me. My Uncle Marco told me about, started with my Uncle Marco's story that he told us from his Seattle kitchen as he was making us his fresh caught fish and chips for me and my family. And as Marco cooked his dinner, he told the story of his grandfather, his papu, a Sephardic Jewish immigrant from Turkey who arrived here in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1900s. And Marco went on to tell me about attending his papu's funeral. It was a typical Sephardic Jewish event, close family, friends, relatives he hadn't seen in years. So many familiar faces, but there were some people he didn't recognize at all. A handful of Japanese American guests began to arrive, and nobody knew who they were or why they came. And what Marco found out is that his papu would help these families when they were forced out of the neighborhood and incarcerated during World War II. His story only took a couple minutes to tell, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. How does a Jewish immigrant with family still overseas, threatened by the Holocaust, end up helping out his Japanese American neighbors here at home? Did they stay in touch after the war? Were there other similar stories like this? I had a ton of questions, so I went back to interview my Uncle Marco and get some information. So hold on a sec. Marco, where are you? Okay, he's in the back there. Everybody give him a round of applause real quick. I just want to say thank you for telling this story and letting it grow into what it has become. If anybody wants to talk to Marco, make sure you do afterwards. He's the best. So together, Marco and I started to do some research to find out more about the story and what happened. And so we talked to our families and people from the old neighborhood to see if we could dig up some more details about his papu's history and find out what happened. And I knew Marco was named after his papu, Marco Calvo, a Sephardic Jewish immigrant. His papu had spent the beginning of his life on the small fishing island of Marmara, but the region was becoming very unstable for Jews at the time. So Marco and many other Sephardic Jews came to America in hope of a better life, and many of them arrived right here in the Northwest. I went into the Ellis Island immigration database and found the official immigration documents for when Marco Calvo immigrated to Seattle in 1920. We knew that he lived in the Central District and he worked at Pike Place fishing markets, which at the time were primarily Japanese and Jewish owned. We knew that Marco Calvo owned and ran the Ferry Dock Tavern at Pier 52 down by the waterfront. And we talked to several people who remembered him. So we were digging up all kinds of vague details here and there, but as the weeks went by, we just weren't getting that far. Seattle had changed a lot since the 40s, and the people who would have any more information about the story had died a long time ago. But I kept asking around, and as I talked to people, I kept hearing this name pop up in conversations. Have you talked to Devin Naar? You've got to go see Professor Devin Naar at University of Washington. So I looked him up, and he agreed to meet up on campus. And that first meeting was when I realized that this project was about much more than just some family folklore. Devin started talking about the parallels between the Sephardic and the Japanese communities in Seattle. I learned about the Seattle Central District, a place where immigrants and minorities had an opportunity to get to know each other as friends. And I started to learn about other stories of people who reached out to help their neighbors during the war. Devin showed me these maps of the Seattle Central District, which highlighted just how unique of an area this was. These maps were based on a house-to-house survey conducted in 1939. For those of you who can't see, that's the Sephardic Jews, Japanese. Yeah, so there were pockets where people lived, but they all just kind of overlapped each other. People of different backgrounds and cultures lived right up against each other in this community. So at that first meeting, Devin gave me a ton of resources and information, and he encouraged me to start looking into my own history. So word of warning, if you reach out to a historian for advice for an art project, they're going to give you a ton of homework. Devin challenged me to dig deeper into this story, and I'm so glad he did. Devin, without your guidance and your passion, this project would very likely just be back in my studio still collecting dust. So I was going to do the intro, but it's already been done. But I will add, he did also write the afterword for We Are Not Strangers, which is incredible. I'm really glad he's here. Help me welcome Devin Naar.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate in the creation of this amazing graphic novel. And I'm really thrilled to be here and to share the stage as well this evening. I just wanted to offer a few brief remarks about this book. And when I say it's really a remarkable book, I'm not kidding because, and it's not only because I was somehow a little bit involved in it behind the scenes, although that did make it more incredible, no doubt. No, but I think it's a landmark book in many ways. It's a landmark graphic novel. As far as I'm aware, it is the first graphic novel depiction of Sephardic Jewish life in the United States, featuring Ladino expressions and authentic artifacts and imagery drawn from the Sephardic Jewish experience. And for those of you who grew up or are from Seattle and are familiar with the Central District, certainly the old Central District, some of the sights and scenes and images will be familiar to you. And I'm curious, is anybody here of Sephardic Jewish heritage by any chance? Wow, mashallah. Is anybody here of Japanese heritage? Wow, very nice. That's great. Does anybody have connections to the Central District? Wow, very nice. So you are the audience for this book, but the audience is a much bigger audience because I think the story that is told here is a very special story, not only because of the way in which it features a Sephardic Jewish family and brings you a taste of the food, the sounds of the language, the community environment, and the customs, but because it is not only a Sephardic Jewish story. It is a story that is equally intertwined with that of a Japanese family and the fate of the Japanese community here in Seattle in one of the darkest chapters in US history during the experience of incarceration. And to think about the ways in which these two community stories have been both intertwined and also dramatically divergent, I think is a really important point to think about. And one of the ways in which these two stories are connected is actually through the category that was initially assigned to both Japanese people and Sephardic Jewish people when they arrived in this country. Even though they came from very different parts of the world, they spoke different languages, and they looked very different from each other. They were both pigeonholed by the category of Oriental. Oriental referring to people from the Far East, and also Oriental as a category that was assigned to people from, let's say, the Near East. So some of the first Sephardic Jewish organization in New York, for example, was called the Federation of Oriental Jews, because that is how the broader American and white American society saw people from beyond the boundaries of Europe, essentially. They couldn't really make a differentiation between, the Near East, the Far East, it's the East, it's far away, it is different. And that became a kind of stigma that Sephardic Jews who came to the United States had to really work to overcome. And one of the ways that they did that was trying to promote a different category for understanding themselves as Sephardic Jews or as Spanish Jews. And when they referred to them as Spanish Jews, and they actually had to launch a campaign among themselves and in the public to get themselves and broader society to be convinced that that should be how they should be described, it would bring them into Europe, and it would do something else. It would bring them in closer proximity to whiteness and the protections that whiteness could afford them in the United States, and specifically here in Seattle. And that's where the stories also begin to diverge. And that helps us explain partly like the experience of Jews and Sephardic Jews in particular in this country and in Washington State has been a challenging history. You may know that Washington State was the only state that put a pro-Nazi candidate on the 1936 presidential ballot, and that it is from Washington State where the national movement for immigration restriction was initiated by a local congressman here, Albert Johnson, who was vehemently anti-Semitic, and he wanted to see immigration restriction imposed in this country nearly 100 years ago precisely to keep Jews out. So it wasn't the most easy experience for Jews coming to this country, but in comparison to the fate of Japanese, those stories diverged, and it set up a possibility for the relationship between Marco and Sam as depicted in this graphic novel to develop, where Marco had some of the protections that came with whiteness, that came with American citizenship. And that was not also new in the Sephardic Jewish experience. There was one other episode in the history of Sephardic Jews, not that distant history, but bringing us back to the Ottoman Empire, where Sephardic Jews intervened on behalf of their neighbors. This is a very unknown incident, and really the only place it is documented is in oral histories that were gathered here in Seattle in the 1930s. What is the episode I'm speaking about? In the context of the Armenian massacres, the Armenian genocide, which began in the 1890s in the Ottoman Empire, you have a fascinating scenario that develops. And it is recounted, as I mentioned, by people who came here from the Sephardic community here to Seattle. When the Ottoman state was persecuting Armenians over 100 years ago, we have oral histories that suggest that some of their Jewish neighbors intervened to try to save their Armenian neighbors. And how did they do this? They gave their Armenian neighbors Jewish prayer shawls, kippot, yarmulkes to cover their hairs, and they gave them Hebrew books. and told them when the representatives of the Ottoman state came looking to kill Armenians that they should say and show that they were Jews. And I think this may be the only time in history where somebody dressed up like a Jew to not get killed. But there is, in the history and in the cultural memory, this antecedent to the intervening on behalf of one's neighbors, whether it was Armenians in the context of the Ottoman Empire or Japanese neighbors here in Seattle in the context of Japanese incarceration. So I will leave it at that, and those are just some introductory remarks, but I encourage you to delve deeper, not only into the graphic novel itself, but to explore the long occluded interactions, relationships, and bonds of solidarity that once operated and existed here in the Seattle area. And I would just add offer one final remark, which is we often think about history as getting like progressively, things get better. You know, this is sort of how we sometimes think about things. But what's interesting in the way that the graphic novel begins, for me, one of the things that really stuck with me, is the way in which the Japanese folks who attend the funeral were not known to anybody in the family, which suggests to me that that world that was embodied and imagined in the Central District, a world of bonds and friendship between Japanese people and Sephardic Jewish people and their black neighbors and all that diversity, in some ways maybe we've become further separated out from each other rather than more integrated. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons why Marco kept his tale a secret for all of those years.
So after that first meeting with Devin, I started to think about my own memories from the Seattle Central District. When I was a kid, we lived in the suburbs, but I used to tag along with my own papu to the city to run errands. He loved to take me through the old neighborhoods and tell me stories about growing up in the CD. We usually take some detour, grab some dim sum or cioppino at one of the fish markets. And he always seemed to know the owners. Like wherever we went, he always seemed to know everybody. And as a kid, I never really understood why we had to drive all the way into the city just to go to the bank or pick up some salmon for dinner. But looking back, I think he just really wanted to stay connected with the community there. He was from a family of Jewish immigrants, and most of his family overseas had been wiped out by the Holocaust. And the Central District was a place full of people with similar backgrounds, and he felt really comfortable there. So when I started this project, my papu wasn't around anymore. But I decided to do exactly what we used to do together. So I jumped in my car and I headed to the city and started exploring, and I also started to do some drawing. Here's my first sketch of the original Sephardic Bikur Cholim synagogue in the CD. As I came across important landmarks or settings, I would snap some photos and start sketching. This is the location of the Ferry Dock Tavern, the real tavern which Marco Calvo ran and owned. This was a setting I used for a ton of the character scenes. And so the more I kind of immersed myself into the environments, I was really able to solidify the setting of the story. I could put in important landmarks into the backgrounds of my scenes. This is Washington Hall, a historic public dance and music hall, which was the gathering place and settlement house for many immigrants. So reference material was a huge part of this process. And that was the same for when I was designing my characters. I looked at a lot of old pictures, some from old family photos, and others I found from the time period, which I used to help create the characters in the story. I started using some of the information I was learning about where the characters in the story came from. And I used old newspaper headlines to set the time frame of the scenes, for the scenes. I also used a lot of reference photos I found online, and I started compiling images to draw from when creating these scenes. But every once in a while, I would have an idea for a character pose that I just couldn't find a reference for. And I just had trouble envisioning in my head, so I would have my family pose for me. And I just wanted to show a couple of these now and take a second to say thank you to my family, who's constantly subjected to me rushing into their rooms, interrupting whatever they're doing, forcing them into some strange pose. I take their pictures to draw from. But a lot of times I'll come right back in and make them pose again from a different angle. A lot of times I make them use props. And they have no context for what is happening or why. So a big thank you to Lisa, Clara, and Hazel for your patience and willingness to do this for me whenever I ask you. You guys make my job a heck of a lot easier. So in the same way that I rely on reference material for the artwork, the same goes for writing my scenes. I really wanted all the things that happened to my characters to come from true stories or anecdotes I pick up along the way. And so one of the most valuable places for source material that I discovered throughout this whole process was Densho.org. Densho is the Japanese art incarceration archive based here in Seattle. And this is where I started to learn about what happened to the Japanese American community here in Seattle during the war. Now, I don't know how it is for all of you, but for me, I barely learned anything about this time period when I was in school. I mean, I learned a lot about the Holocaust in Hebrew school and even in public school, but the incarceration camps were barely a small blip that we brushed over in history class. And what I definitely didn't piece together until working on this project was that these events were happening simultaneously. The main character in We Are Not Strangers is faced with this dilemma. As a Jew, he's relying on the US as an ally against the Nazis, while at the same time, his Japanese American friends and neighbors are being forced into camps right here in America. This is something I hadn't even thought about, and when I discovered the Densho archive, I started to learn a lot of things that I'd never heard before. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, 120,000 Japanese Americans were stripped of their rights and forced into camps under suspicion of disloyalty to the United States. Most people lost everything, including property, businesses, possessions. 2/3 of the people imprisoned were born right here in America. They were native-born American citizens. Not one prisoner was ever found guilty of any crime. And when they were released, most people came home to virtually nothing and had to start their lives over from scratch. But there were some rare stories of people who reached out to help, especially in communities where people from different backgrounds had a chance to get to know each other. There are stories of people who rented out their neighbors' homes for them and collected rent money to pay the mortgage, like in Marco's family story. And there are stories of people helping by keeping businesses afloat, storing people's possessions, caretaking properties, so that when they were finally released from the camps, their neighbors still had something to come home to. So I spent a lot of time on Densho, researching the stories, watching video, oral history archives, and eventually I decided to reach out to Densho for help, and they were absolutely amazing. The historians and staff at Densho provided multiple read-throughs, gave me feedback, pointed me in other directions for resources. So if you're interested in learning more, I highly suggest checking out densho.org. But in the meantime, I have something even better. I'm not going to go through your entire bio again. It's too long and impressive. We all know. I'm so glad you're here. Please help me welcome Tom Ikeda.
I didn't know about this book until Karen Maeda Ullman contacted me and says, you need to read this book. And Karen, for those of you who don't know Karen, she worked at LA Bay Bookstore for a long time. She's my kind of go-to person for books. And so when she told me I needed to read this book, I thought I would. And when I read this, it hit me on a very personal level. I grew up in the Central District, Rainier Valley, Sewer Park area. And so very much the story, even though I'm sort of a historian of Japanese American history, the Sephardic Jew families were very much part of my growing up. And like at Franklin High School, where I graduated, about 1/3 of the student population was Asian American, 1/3 was African American, and 1/3 was white, of which about 1/3 of that was Jewish. And so it was a very diverse, which is a little bit different, Devin, when you talked about that, the generations where maybe the African American, the Japanese, and the Jewish didn't do so much in that generation. For my generation, we very much grew up together, and I think there was a comfort level for me to go into many homes and actually attend memorial services at some of the synagogues that was shown in the book. But what really resonated with me with this book in terms of, I really got choked up because what really struck me was, and it's been mentioned, how rare it was that people helped Japanese Americans during World War II. In the introduction written by Ken Mochizuki, who's on this, the front row, Ken wrote the introduction to the book, and he talked about how there were just a few. I think, Ken, you mentioned, who'd you mention? You mentioned Gene Boyd, who was interesting because of your sports background. That made sense, but he was kind of like the athletic director at the Collins Playfield, and gave some equipment. Reverend Emery Andrews, or Reverend Andy, from the Japanese Baptist Church. And I think you mentioned the farm workers, Filipino and the Native American farm workers on Bainbridge Island, and how they help. I know Frank Abba's out there, and I'm sure you're asked the same thing. And so other names may come up, like Walt Woodward of Bainbridge Island. Someone who helped my family was Father Tibasar. But I guess the interesting thing is just how few. And if you talk to the people who know Japanese American history, we keep mentioning the same names because there are just a few of them. And the question I used to ask myself, why is that? Because Japanese Americans weren't that hard to find in Seattle. Right before the war, we were, Japanese American community was the largest non-white population in Seattle. There were 9,000. Between 2 to 3% of the population. They were very prominent in things like, fresh produce for the city. Like Broadway High School, 25% of the population of Broadway High School was Japanese American. And so it was common to see, if you look at the yearbooks of Franklin High School, Garfield, Broadway, valedictorians, athletes, student leaders were Japanese Americans. And so there were lots of opportunities for people to know Japanese Americans, and yet it was very rare that we had these cases where people would help out. And so why is that? And so I'm going to share a story that I shared 2 weeks ago at a high school in Seattle. I was talking to a group of 10th graders, and about Japanese American history, what happened in Seattle. And I showed them a clip of an interview I did with Aki Kurose. And Aki was a 10th grader at Garfield High School, so Bobby Stern, same high school that you went to. But this was right before the war. And so I chose this clip because I realized I'm talking to 10th graders, so it'd be interesting for them to hear the story of a 10th grader. And Aki Kurose, you might recognize the name. She was a well-known educator, peace activist. The Seattle Public Schools honored her by naming one of the middle schools after her, the Aki Kurose Middle School, which previously was a Sharpless Junior High School, which I actually attended, which is very much South Seattle, very much, and a lot of Sephardic Jews attended Sharpless Junior High School. And so the story that I showed these 10th graders was Aki talking about right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And first she talks about the confusion, the discussion she had with her parents. But the dramatic part of the clip was when she went to school the next day. So Monday, December 8th, she goes to school, Garfield, and one of her favorite teachers actually approaches her and confronts Aki by saying, "You people bombed Pearl Harbor." And she said it in a very confrontational tone. And Aki talks about how threatened she felt, how up to that point, she thought of herself as this sort of normal American kid, but now she's this American, an enemy. And the reason I talk about this is this climate of hate and fear that kind of prevailed, that made it really, really difficult. And so, I mentioned that because, to the students, I said, so what can we learn from this? And so I talked about, that, for Aki, going from, just because of some event that occurred, going from kind of this popular girl that got really good grades, extracurricular, people would all say hi to her in the hallways, to all of a sudden the next day being viewed as the enemy. And that was kind of the tenor. And so how does this happen? One, we know that it didn't really just happen with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that there were decades of anti-Asian sentiment going on. Some of the things that Devin was talking about. But for Japanese and Chinese in particular, when they first started immigrating in the late 1800s, they were viewed not as kind of immigrants coming to the country, but oftentimes the newspapers would call them this invasion force. They were here not to immigrate; they were here to be this sort of force that would come, this invasion that would ultimately convert the west coast of the United States into either Japan or China. And so that was kind of the tenor. The other thing that happened for the Japanese Americans that we see today is the power of the media and politicians. What I've learned by looking at this was how much the newspapers and politicians really kind of sensationalized the news and actually promoted misinformation because there were incentives. For papers, sensational music or sensational news sells more newspapers back then. Today, sensational news, sometimes untruths, you get more clicks. So there's an incentive for this. Same thing with politicians. That you look back, politicians were very anti-Japanese because it got them more votes, and that's what was going on. So you had this sort of this climate that made it really difficult. That led to what happened. And it then promotes this sort of climate of fear. So I talked to these students about how, in a similar way, when the screen's showing similarities. When I was at the Holocaust Center for Humanity, they have this thing called the pyramid of hate, and how violence or these policy things just don't happen out of the blue. They happen when this negative rhetoric. You sort of make this group, and you otherize them. You make them somehow different. You make them dangerous. So all that was going on during World War II. And that's kind of the climate why it was so difficult to actually go against that to help Japanese Americans during World War II. And so, coming back to Marco, this book, and why it really struck me and why it's so important is, why don't more of us do this? And so here, I think about at Densho, we have these terms we use, bystanders and upstanders. And so by how we define upstander, Marco in the book was an upstander. He saw something going on that he felt was wrong, he felt wasn't just, and he decided to do something. He talked to his Japanese American friend, they came up with a plan, and then he took action. That's actually really very rare, as we've talked about before. But that's what you would hope. It took a lot of courage and a lot of generosity. Whereas most people are what we call bystanders. They may know something may not be right, or something isn't what they would like to see. But most people will choose to really just watch. And they may grumble, they may talk to their friends about why this isn't right, but in action, very little happens. And so what we talk about at Densho is how do we promote, or how do we educate people so that people are more like upstanders. And so in today's world, we haven't talked about it, but we know there's a lot of hate and fear in the world today. I mean, we have the conflict in Israel and in Gaza. We have the southern border with refugees. And there's a lot of information that we hear. A lot of it's scary. A lot of it is very emotional. And a lot of it, unfortunately, may not be true. A lot of it is there to generate a lot of hate, fear. I worked at Microsoft 30, 40 years ago, and it's something that I would see. I mean, and I'll sometimes even you have to admit that I did the same thing. There's something strategically you would do against competition called FUD. It's called fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That if you're like trying to come out with another product and you have a competitor, you would sometimes plant these seeds of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about your competitor that to your advantage. And you see this intentionality happening before. And so in closing, I just wanted to just, in some ways, get people to think about how you could be an upstander. I'm not going to tell you what to do or how to do this, but my suggestion is do it in community. I mean, there's a lot of people here. You could talk about things, but also talk with the people who are most affected, the ones who are vulnerable, the ones who are being targeted, and find out how they're doing, see if you can support them, and see if there's anything you can do. And the thing that I've learned when you do this, it's not just like, something you should do. It actually will change you. I mean, there's a welling up of, compassion, wisdom, love, and generosity that comes through this process that you get from the people you work with and the people you help that is unforgettable. And so with that, thank you so much for listening, and thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Tom. So I just want to take a few minutes to highlight some of the other people and organizations who helped me out with my research. I want to thank For Culture. I had never applied for a grant before, and they made that an amazing experience. It helped me lay out a plan for this project and get initial feedback and encouragement. So if any artists out there have a cultural project in the works, definitely check out For Culture's grant opportunities. I also want to thank the Washington State Jewish Historical Society, similar to Densho, and that they have amazing archives, resources, and events. So if you're interested in Jewish history, this is definitely the place to go. There were a lot of other organizations that helped me out with my research. As I was putting this slide together, I was like, wow, it looks like I know what I'm doing. Like I'm a professional researcher or something, but I just wanted to make it clear that this all kind of happened by accident. Every person I talked to along the way, from Devin all the way through Densho, through the whole process, helped me by, pointing me in somewhere else for resources, and I just kind of followed the leads. I also relied on conversations and feedback from local authors, some of whom are here today. I highly recommend these amazing books. Special shout out to Ken Mochizuki, author of Baseball Saved Us, who wrote the foreword for We Are Not Strangers. So along with all the help from organizations and professional writers, I want to just take a minute to talk about the face-to-face conversations I had with some people, which added so much to this project. A lot of times in interviews, I would hear people mention an important landmark that I could incorporate into the background of one of my scenes. But sometimes my conversations with people would turn into a completely new chapter. One example, I knew the Sephardic Bechor Holim synagogue was an important Seattle Central landmark, and I wanted to do a scene there, but I didn't know what the environment was like back in the 40s at synagogue. So I asked around, and one of my mom's friends, Debbie Wellner, who's here, had early childhood memories of going to synagogue. She told us about the women's section in the balcony where people would gossip and shush each other during the service while the rabbi was trying to speak. So I used that as a foundation for one of my chapters. Another example of a conversation that led to a whole new chapter. We have a family friend, Linda Suyama, who owns the Azuma Gallery here in Seattle. Amazing Japanese fine art gallery. If you haven't gone, you definitely have to go check it out. So I went to visit the gallery and talked to Linda about this project, and she brought out these Japanese woodblock prints. And we were talking about them, and the prints became the focal point of this scene of a father teaching his daughter about their family origins. The artwork ended up being a unique way for my characters to discuss their family history. So I kept hearing about Link's Tackle Shop from people I was interviewing. And it was a Japanese-American owned store in the CD. I thought the tackle shop would be a great setting for one of my scenes. So I got in touch with the owners, Jerry and Maria Beppu, who were nice enough to invite me into their house for an interview. And I told them that my story was about highlighting people who reached out to help their neighbors during the war. And when they heard that, they both just kind of looked at each other and they smiled. And Jerry went on to tell me the story of his dad, an immigrant from Japan who struggled to make a living in Seattle. But before the war, his tackle shop was really starting to take off. And it was getting popular and the family was feeling stable. And one day he took his family up for a day at skiing at Snoqualmie Pass. And when they drove back into Seattle, they found out Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And it wasn't long after that they were forced to close the tackle shop and evacuate to Puyallup Fairgrounds Assembly Center, where they'd be held for months before being forced into camps. After years of living in the camps, the family returned home, and to their surprise, a Jewish insurance agent, friend of theirs, had continued to pay the insurance premiums while they were away. And when the policy matured, the family received a payout and were able to reopen Link's tackle shop. The insurance agent even checked up on the shop while they were away and stored supplies for them. There's a lot more to the story. I was able to record the interview, and it's up on Densho if you want to check that out. But I just wanted to talk about this because these stories were so rare, and when I heard these examples, it was just another great story I could weave into my narrative. So this book has been out for about a month now, and I keep getting asked why I think these stories are so relevant today. Well, there is still a lot of ignorance and violence out there, as we unfortunately see in the news all the time, which affects these communities right here in our neighborhoods. And sometimes it feels like the cycle of conflict will just never end. I know I'm not the only one who has felt pretty hopeless, especially over the course of the past couple weeks. But true stories of real people from different backgrounds working together and helping each other during uncertain times, I think we can all agree that's something we could use a heck of a lot more of these days. Sometimes it feels almost like we're encouraged to look at each other as strangers, and I hope that the stories I've highlighted in this book can act as a reminder that it doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
Maybe can I ask a question for both of you while we wait for a second? Sure. I mean, I was struck, because when you reached out to me about doing this project, Josh, I started looking into it more than I had before, and I started talking to people, and I was struck because one family that I spoke to spoke about how they had a memory of sheltering a Japanese family like in their basement, but they didn't want it to be published, and they didn't really want it to be made public. And I don't know, maybe this is a question for you, Tom. It relates also to what happened with Marco here, where he seemed to sort of keep the memory of having helped his Japanese American friends and neighbors kind of like on the DL, didn't publicize it, although now we might want to be celebrating people like that. Do you have a sense of why people who may have intervened on behalf of their Japanese American neighbors would like to keep that private and would not like for that to be known?
I really don't. I mean, that's a something, because I'm the stories I heard come from the other side,
right? And
they were helped, and you're right. You don't hear it from the other side. There was a story in the CD that was one of the most moving stories that I can remember, and it had to do with Henry Miyatake, who was at Washington Middle School, Washington Junior High School, and he was there starting school in the fall of 1941, so right before the war started. And when he got in, there was a Polish Jew that had just enrolled at Washington Middle School also, and the Polish Jew's last name must have started with an M or something, close to Miyatake, because Henry said because of that, they sat next to each other, but they became friends. And it was interesting, but they became friends. And then right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Polish Jew told they're taking this woodworking class together, and Henry was going to start making a suitcase. And the Polish Jew said, "Oh, Henry, you bad things are going to happen." And Henry said, "Oh, no way! I grew up here. I'm American, and we have this Constitution. Nothing's going to happen." They said, "No, something bad's going to happen." And so it goes on, and as Henry's making the suitcase, the Polish Jew tells Henry, "You should put a false bottom on your suitcase." And Henry says, "What? Why would I do that?" They said, "No, you should do this." And so Henry actually did. He put a false bottom on there. And Henry, ended up later on, career-wise, he became this, really kind of, very prominent Boeing engineer. Had patents. He was essentially a genius, and he took really pride in what he did. And so he had this incredibly, he said, this really beautiful wood veneer finish to his suitcase. He said, "Oh, it was gorgeous. It was stained and everything." And then his friend, the Polish Jew, said, Henry, you should paint it black. Just paint black. And Henry, was beside himself. Why would I do this? It's so beautiful. He says, you don't want to bring attention to you. And even at this point, Henry didn't know what was going to happen to him or the Japanese. And he said, it's going to be okay. But then as the weeks went on, he told the story. It got worse and worse. And then when they got the orders, his friend said, I told you, and so, Henry painted the thing black and had the false bottom. But the touching part was, when the last day that Japanese Americans were at Washington Mills School, and they knew Japanese were all going to move in, and probably like Broadway, there's probably like 20% of the student body was Japanese American at Washington. And so what happened was this Polish Jew, Henry says, it was very emotional. He actually stood up, and he says his English wasn't very good, but he stood up and just actually, lectured the class like, what are you guys doing here? I mean, this is why I left Europe. This is why we had to flee. This is what it's happening here. And Henry got really emotional because he said, as he was leaving, it wasn't much, but the Polish Jew actually gave Henry money too. And again, it was this really touching story of someone who could just really, feel what Henry was going through and trying to help. But I heard the story. I said, oh my gosh, this is such a powerful story. And, like you want to do, you start researching, like, can I find this other person? And we looked at the names and everything. We couldn't find it and couldn't find any stories about this. But it gets to, why aren't those stories? I don't really know.
I had actually something to add to that. I did a ton of these interviews, right? And most people didn't know about, what happened to their grandparents or parents during that time. And I heard, we don't talk about bad things and, don't draw attention and stuff like that. And yeah, it is kind of confusing. But so in Devin, isn't there like 7 levels of giving in Judaism or something like that? And then one of I think the top one is like, you don't tell anyone about it.
Yeah.
And I kind of think, I mean, I don't know if this is bad or not, but I'm kind of like, it's kind of a disservice to not tell, because when I hear these stories, it makes me want to do that. It's like, it makes you feel like you could do it too. So I don't know. I'd like to hear more of those stories. So if you're keeping it to yourself.
Great. So we have a couple of questions here, and I've been appointed the question reader here. One of the questions goes as follows. It seems that Marco's wife was really the nudge for him to do what he should do. Can you tell us more about his wife, and why isn't she given more significance in the story?
Wow.
I know whose question this is based on. This person's great handwriting, actually.
Okay, I'll have to take just see who that is. That's definitely a question for Marco, who's back there. Definitely talk to him about that. No. I guess the only answer to that is every person I talk to along the way would have a story, and I'd be like, that's got to be its own graphic novel, right? Because everybody just has all these amazing stories, and yeah, so Marco's that'd be an incredible sequel, right? I mean, let's figure out how to tell that story. So yeah, I would like to hear more about it.
Great. Another question. Are there particular artists or authors who have influenced you or inspired your work?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, all the novels I mentioned that I researched and helped tell the story. But I mean, I've been doing comics and drawing cartoons ever since I was a kid. Actually, my 7th grade teacher showed up here tonight, and I haven't seen her since then. It was a huge surprise. She showed me a poster that I did, and she kept in her classroom. So I was reading a lot of cartoons back then, and that even back then it was considered a pretty low form of literature. So I'm just really happy to see that this art form has grown and taken seriously. So I could name a bunch of cartoons, everything from Calvin and Hobbes all the way up through manga and all kinds of other stuff. But yeah, comics in general.
Great. Here's another question related to your artistic style. Can you say a little bit more about the mediums that you use to produce your images? And this person observes that there's sort of like a film noir style, perhaps to some of the images. Is that right? Was that part of your intention?
I really did want to capture Seattle's kind of, monotone, like little darkness to it. As far as my artistic style goes, I draw in pencil and I draw on my iPad mostly actually now. That's that's just kind of my process now. But my style, it's hard to explain my style because it's just grown over the years. So I can't see it probably very clearly. I'm actually more curious to hear other people's view on that.
So this is for Tom. There's a room full here of Franklin and Garfield grads. Who's a Franklin grad here? Who's a Garfield grad? Wow, very nice.
I think more Franklin here.
Yeah. What was that? Roosevelt. We got Roosevelt? Yeah. So the question is, what year did you graduate, Tom? This is from one of Marco Calvo's daughters, Esther Myman.
1974. So I think next year will be my 50th.
Wow. Mashallah, as they say. Congratulations. That's great. Here's a question about your research, Josh, which is, for the stories that you were able to recount, did you find documentary evidence, or was it really through oral history? Like, could you confirm, I don't know, some of the aspects of the story that you, like, I don't know, any of the transfer of properties or any of the receipts or anything?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So not on, and that's kind of the same with, it's one of the first questions. People didn't talk about those things. Even some of the stuff I found on Densho, I'm trying to find and talk to people about the records and the details. And yeah, it's really hard to find. I think it's just because it was so rare for these things to happen. But yeah, I just really relied on oral history and talking to people who had similar stories and weaving those details in.
Okay, great.
Any questions for you, Devin?
No. I preemptively answered all of them.
Okay.
That's all the questions I've got.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much
Thank
for
you.
your support.
Thank you.